It was colder than usual for that time of year, the kind of chill that crept through layers and found its way into your bones. The parking lot was deserted, a stretch of cracked asphalt illuminated only by flickering, dim streetlights. I had just finished loading the last bag into the trunk of my car, my breath fogged in the icy air as I slammed the trunk shut, my hands fumbling for the keys in my pocket. That's when I saw him. At first I thought I was imagining it. He stood a few cars away, leaning casually against a dented sedan. His arms were crossed, his gaze fixed in my direction. I hadn't noticed anyone else when I first arrived, and the lot had been empty during my trips back and forth. Something about him felt off. I glanced away, pretending not to notice, and hurried to the driver's side door. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of the car handle when I realized my keys weren't in my hand anymore. They must have fallen. I crouched down, scanning the dark ground, my heartbeat quickening. When I looked back up, he was closer. He wasn't leaning anymore either. He stood straight, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. My stomach twisted as I fumbled to grab the keys, my fingers trembling. I unlocked the door and climbed in as fast as I could, locking it behind me. The sound of the lock clicking echoed in the silence. I kept my eyes on the dashboard, pretending to scroll through my phone, but I could feel his stare burning into me. He hadn't moved, yet I could sense his presence, oppressive and suffocating. When I finally mustered the courage to glance up, I saw him walking toward me, slow but deliberate. I didn't wait. My hand flew to the ignition, and the engine sputtered to life. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty lot. Empty, except for him. He'd stopped now, standing motionless in the beam of my headlights. I couldn't make out his face. The shadows clung to him like a second skin. I reversed out of the space, trying to keep my movements calm and measured. But as I turned toward the exit, I caught sight of him in the rearview mirror. He was walking back to his car. Relief washed over me. Maybe he was just waiting for someone else. Maybe this was all in my head. The relief didn't last. When I pulled onto the main road, I noticed headlights appear in the mirror. They were too close, too precise. I turned onto a side street, and the car followed. At first I tried to dismiss it. It was a busy area, and we could just be heading in the same direction. But with every turn I made, they followed. No hesitation, no delay. This wasn't coincidence. My mind raced. I couldn't go home, not with them behind me. I didn't want to lead them to my street, to my house. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, and the car behind me matched my speed. Every move I made, they mirrored it. Left, right, U-turn, it didn't matter. I took a sharp turn onto a quieter road. The houses here were dark, their occupants likely asleep. The streetlights were fewer and farther between. The car behind me turned as well, their headlights flashing in my mirror like taunting signals. My palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. Suddenly the car's headlights began flashing rhythmically. On, off, on, off. My stomach twisted into knots. Were they trying to signal me or scare me? I didn't know, and I didn't care. All I knew was that I needed to get away. Up ahead, a gas station, its bright lights glowing like a beacon in the night. I didn't think twice. I turned sharply into the lot, my tires screeching against the pavement. I parked as close as I could to the front entrance, where the security cameras were visible. My hands shook as I turned off the engine and locked the doors. The car didn't follow. It lingered at the entrance of the gas station lot, its headlights aimed directly at me. For a moment, everything was still. Then it sped off, disappearing into the night. I sat there, frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. I watched the empty road, half expecting the car to return. When it didn't, I finally forced myself to step out. The fluorescent lights of the gas station felt like a shield as I walked inside. The clerk gave me a puzzled look, but I didn't bother explaining. Instead, I used the payphone to call a friend to pick me up. When they arrived, I left my car there. I couldn't bring myself to drive it home, not that night. I never found out who was in that car, or why they followed me, but even now the memory lingers. When I'm out late at night, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, searching for headlights that seem too close, too persistent. And sometimes, I think I still see them. Story 2. It started 2 weeks ago, just a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like the shuffle of feet across a carpet. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I live alone, in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building, the kind of place where every wall creaks, and the pipes groan like they're carrying ghosts instead of water. But then, the sounds grew louder. It always happened late at night, just as I was settling into bed. I'd hear it, a faint tap tap tap, coming from the direction of my living room. It was soft at first, then would stop entirely. I'd sit up, straining to hear over the sound of my heartbeat. When it didn't return, I'd convince myself it was the wind, or maybe a neighbor. The 3rd night, I decided to check. Wrapped in a blanket, I tiptoed into the living room, clutching my phone with the flashlight on. The room was exactly as I'd left it: sofa, coffee table, and a single heavy curtain covering the old window that looked out onto the fire escape. I stared at that window for a long moment, my eyes tracing the outline of the curtain. Was it moving? No, just my imagination. Still, I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I told myself I'd been overreacting. But when I came home from work, something was different. The curtain, my thick, beige curtain, was slightly askew, just a few inches pulled back, like someone had peeked outside. I told myself it was the breeze, even though the window was locked. That night, the tapping returned. It started at 1:37 a.m. I know because I looked at the clock the moment I heard it. A soft, deliberate tap, 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 as if someone was tapping on glass with their fingernail. My stomach twisted. The sound was coming from the window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, staring at the doorway to the living room, half expecting someone to walk through. But no one did. The tapping stopped after what felt like hours, but was probably just a few minutes. I forced myself to go to the window the next morning, in daylight, when everything felt less menacing. The glass was smudged, like someone, or something, had pressed their hand against it. By the 5th night, I was scared to go to bed. I kept the lights on, stayed up with a book, and tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But at exactly 1:37 a.m., the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a kitchen knife and stormed into the living room, flipping on the light. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. Silence. The curtain was still. I inched closer, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. I reached out with my free hand and yanked the curtain aside. Nothing, just the empty fire escape and the city lights in the distance. But then I noticed something. Scratched into the glass, faint but unmistakable, were 3 words. "Let me in." I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day I called the landlord. He promised to send someone to check the window, but I could tell he thought I was overreacting. I felt ridiculous even explaining it. That night, I tried to stay awake again, but exhaustion got the better of me. I woke to the sound of the curtain being drawn. Not tapping this time, movement. I froze, barely breathing, my eyes locked on the doorway. The living room light was off, but I could see a faint glow spilling in from the streetlights outside. And then I saw it. A shadow moving across the wall, slow, deliberate. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. By the time I shone it toward the doorway, the shadow was gone. The final night was the worst. I decided to stay at a friend's place, but as I was packing, the power went out. My apartment was plunged into darkness, save for the faint light of my phone. I grabbed it and turned on the flashlight, my hands shaking. And then I heard it. Not tapping this time, whispering. Soft, unintelligible murmurs coming from the living room. I crept toward the doorway, knife in one hand and phone in the other. The whispering grew louder as I approached. It wasn't coming from the window anymore. It was coming from the walls. I swung the flashlight around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. Just my empty apartment and the sound of my own panicked breathing. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a single clear voice. "I'm here." The light on my phone flickered, then went out. I don't remember running out of the apartment, but I must have. I ended up at my friend's place, trembling and incoherent. When I went back the next day to collect my things, the window was shattered, the curtain ripped to shreds, and scrawled across the walls in jagged, uneven letters was a single phrase: "I told you to let me in." I moved out the next week. I try not to think about that apartment anymore, but sometimes, late at night, when the wind is still and the air feels heavy, I hear the faintest sound.
Tap, tap, tap.
And I wonder if it followed me. It was raining the night I first saw him, a steady drizzle that misted the air and turned the streets slick with reflections of orange streetlights. I had just finished a late shift at the diner and was walking home. The town was small, quiet, the kind of place where people locked their doors but didn't worry too much about why. The shortcut through the park was always faster, and though the winding paths could get eerie at night, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't until I reached the center of the park, a clearing with a single wooden bench, that I noticed him. He stood on the other side of the clearing, near the edge where the trees pressed in. His yellow raincoat caught the light, slick and shiny like it was fresh out of the packaging. The hood was pulled up, obscuring his face, and he held a black umbrella in one hand, its tip resting on the ground. He wasn't moving, just standing there. I slowed my pace, my breath hitching. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. No response. I tried to convince myself he was just a stranger waiting out the rain. Maybe he didn't hear me, but the way he stood so still, it didn't feel right. I forced myself to keep walking, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, his head tilted slightly as if watching me. By the time I got home, I'd convinced myself it was nothing, just some random guy. I made tea, curled up with a book, and tried to forget about him. The next night it rained again. I left the diner feeling uneasy, the memory of the man in the yellow raincoat gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The park was darker this time, the streetlights barely piercing the mist. Halfway through the clearing I saw him again. Same raincoat, same umbrella, same stillness. But this time he was closer. I stopped, my stomach knotting. "Who are you?" I called out. He didn't answer. I took a step back, then another. He raised one hand, not waving, not reaching, just holding it up, palm forward, like a warning. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned and ran. The next few days, I avoided the park entirely, taking the long way home. It added 20 minutes to my walk, but it was worth it for the peace of mind. For a while it worked, until I started seeing him elsewhere. At first it was fleeting, a flash of yellow at the corner of my eye while I stocked shelves at the grocery store, a figure standing under a distant streetlight as I locked up the diner, always far away, never close enough to confront. Then one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I glanced out my apartment window. He was standing on the sidewalk below, looking up at me. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I called the police. They were polite but unhelpful. Without a clear threat, there wasn't much they could do. "It's probably just someone messing with you," the officer said, his tone dismissive. But I knew better. That evening, I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, if she'd seen anyone strange around. She squinted at me through her thick glasses. "You mean the raincoat man?" My blood ran cold. "You've seen him?" She nodded slowly. "Used to be a story we told kids to keep them out of the park at night. They said he'd follow you if you saw him, that he'd keep getting closer and closer unless you confronted him." "What happens if you confront him?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Hargrove shrugged. "No one ever said." That night, the rain came down in sheets, drumming against my windows. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door. I didn't want to leave, didn't want to face him, but I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at shadows, peering over my shoulder at every turn. At 11:13 p.m. I made up my mind. I pulled on my raincoat, grabbed an old flashlight, and stepped out into the storm. The streets were deserted, the world hushed by the rain. My footsteps splashed against the pavement as I made my way to the park. The clearing was empty when I arrived. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all. The rain pattered against the leaves, and the wind whispered through the trees. I stood there, breathing heavily, water dripping from my hood. And then I saw him. He stepped out from between the trees, his yellow raincoat glowing faintly in the dim light. His umbrella was gone, and this time, he was close enough that I could make out his face, or rather, the lack of one. His hood was empty. No eyes, no mouth, just darkness. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He raised his hand again, that same gesture of warning, but now I understood. It wasn't a warning for me to stop, it was for me to run. Behind him, the trees began to move, not with the wind, but with something darker, something massive and shifting. Shadows peeled away from the trunks, spilling across the ground like ink, reaching for him. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I turned and ran, the rain blinding me, my breath tearing out of my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. I haven't seen the man in the yellow raincoat since that night. But sometimes, when the rain falls heavy and the world feels too quiet, I think of him. And I wonder if he was following me to scare me, or if he was trying to protect me from something worse. This story blends psychological tension with an unsettling twist, perfect for a long, suspenseful narration. Let me know if you'd like any tweaks. It was a crisp autumn evening when I first noticed the figure standing at the edge of the woods. The golden hues of sunset were fading into twilight, casting long shadows across my backyard. The air was still, unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I'd been sitting on the porch cradling a warm mug of tea, lost in thought. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The figure was barely visible, partially hidden among the trees. He stood motionless, almost blending into the shadows. His presence was so subtle that if I hadn't glanced up at just the right moment, I might not have noticed him at all. I told myself it was nothing, perhaps a trick of the light or maybe a deer standing oddly upright. I shook it off, took a sip of my tea, and focused on the distant sound of crickets starting their nightly serenade. But the unease lingered, a small knot tightening in my chest. Minutes passed, and I couldn't help but glance back toward the woods. He was still there, unmoving, watching. I felt a chill creep up my spine, and I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a neighbor cutting through the woods or a hiker who had lost their way. But something about the way he stood, rigid, deliberate, and unnervingly still, didn't sit right with me. I set my mug down and stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The warmth of the house enveloped me, but it did little to calm my nerves. I peeked through the curtains, hoping the figure would be gone. He wasn't. For a while, I busied myself with mundane tasks, washing dishes, folding laundry, anything to distract myself. But every few minutes, I'd find my way back to the window, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. Each time, he was there, standing exactly where I'd first seen him, never moving, never turning away. The hours crept by and night fell. The woods became an abyss, the trees melding into a black mass. The figure was harder to see now, but I knew he was still there. My eyes strained against the darkness, catching faint glimpses of his outline whenever the moonlight broke through the clouds. I debated calling someone, a friend, the police, anyone, but what would I say? That a man was standing in the woods, not doing anything, just existing. It sounded absurd, even to me, and yet the unease gnawed at me, relentless and unshakable. By midnight, I was too restless to sit still. I paced the living room, glancing at the clock every few minutes. I kept the curtains closed now, unable to bear the thought of seeing him again. But even without looking, I felt his presence, a heavy weight pressing against my mind. A sudden sound shattered the silence. A faint tapping, barely audible but unmistakable. My breath caught, and I froze, straining to locate the source. It came again, louder this time, a deliberate rhythm against the glass. My heart pounded as I turned toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but the outline of a hand pressed against the fabric was clearly visible. Long fingers splayed out, the palm flat against the glass. The figure had moved. He was no longer at the edge of the woods. He was here, at my window. Panic surged through me, and I backed away, nearly tripping over the coffee table. The tapping continued, steady and measured, as if he knew exactly how much time to leave between each knock to unsettle me further. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers trembling so badly it took 3 tries to get the number right. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline, grounding me just enough to explain the situation. She assured me that an officer would be dispatched immediately. "Stay on the line with me," she said. "Can you see him now?" "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "The curtains are closed." "Is there anywhere you can go to stay safe? A room with a lock?" I nodded, realizing she couldn't see me. "Yes, the bedroom. I'll go there now." Clutching the phone, I made my way down the hall, every creak of the floorboards amplifying my fear. Once inside, I locked the door and pushed a dresser in front of it, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. The operator stayed on the line, her voice a steady hum in the background as I tried to collect myself. Then the knocking stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, more terrifying than the sound itself. I strained to hear anything, footsteps, rustling, anything that might indicate where he was. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. A loud crash shattered the stillness, followed by the sound of breaking glass. He was inside. My mind raced, trying to process what to do. The operator's voice cut through my panic, urging me to stay calm and stay hidden. "The officers are close," she said. "Just a few more minutes." The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew I was trapped. Each step brought him closer, the floorboards creaking under his weight. I held my breath, clutching the phone like a lifeline. My heart felt like it might burst, each beat loud enough to give me away. The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom door. The handle jiggled, then rattled violently as he tried to force it open. The dresser held firm, but it wouldn't last forever. I heard a low, guttural sound, a laugh, quiet and chilling. He knew I was inside. The wail of sirens in the distance was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. It grew louder, closer, until red and blue lights flashed through the thin gap at the top of the curtains. The banging stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps retreating. It took me a moment to realize the operator was still speaking. "They're here," she said. "Stay where you are until they come to you." I heard the front door burst open, followed by voices calling out. Moments later, there was a knock on the bedroom door, and a voice identified itself as a police officer. When I finally opened the door, my legs were so weak I could barely stand. The officers escorted me outside, their presence a shield against the night. They searched the woods and the house but found no sign of the man. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I've moved since then to a place far from any woods. Still, every so often, when the house is quiet and the night is still, I think I hear that faint tapping at the window. It started with the porch light. It was the kind of thing you wouldn't notice at first. A quick flicker here, a dim glow there. It felt more like the bulb was on its last legs than something to worry about. It had been a long week, and little annoyances like that just blurred into the background of my life. I didn't think much about it until the second night. That evening I was curled up on the couch with my cat, Loki, binge-watching an old sitcom. The house was dark except for the soft blue glow of the TV, and outside the rain was falling in a steady rhythm. It was cozy, comforting. Then I saw it, the porch light flickering through the curtains. At first I ignored it. Maybe it was the wind rattling the old bulb or the rain hitting the wiring. But after a while the flickering became rhythmic. 2 quick flashes, a pause, then one long flash. It repeated over and over, almost like it was signaling something. "Maybe it's just faulty wiring," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. But Loki wasn't so easily convinced. He'd been lounging by my feet, but now he was sitting upright, his green eyes fixed on the front door. His ears were perked up, his tail flicking slowly. "What is it, buddy?" I whispered, leaning forward to peek through the curtains. The light continued its strange pattern. 2 quick flashes, a pause, then 1 long flash. The street outside was empty, the rain making everything look hazy under the dim glow of the streetlights. I closed the curtains tightly and decided I'd deal with it in the morning. Faulty lights weren't worth losing sleep over. But that night I couldn't sleep. I woke up to the sound of a faint tapping. It was subtle, almost polite, like someone lightly knocking on a door. Groggy. I checked my phone, 2:47 a.m. "Who knocks on someone's door at this hour?" I muttered, sitting up in bed. The tapping came again, louder this time. I froze, my heart pounding. Loki, who had been sleeping at the foot of my bed, was now alert, his gaze locked on the bedroom door. I grabbed my phone and crept out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. As I reached the top of the stairs, I could see the faint glow of the porch light through the frosted glass of the front door. It was still flickering in that strange pattern. 2 quick flashes, pause, 1 long flash. I held my breath and peered through the peephole. Nothing. No one was there. I exhaled, the tension in my shoulders easing slightly. Maybe it was just the rain or a tree branch tapping against the house. But as I turned to head back upstairs, I heard it again, closer this time. The tapping wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the living room window. My stomach dropped. The living room was just around the corner, separated from the entryway by a narrow hallway. I crept closer, each step feeling heavier than the last. The curtains in the living room were closed, but I could see the faint outline of someone, or something, standing just beyond the glass. A shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light from the street. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so hard I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling as I tried to dial 911. The line connected and I whispered into the receiver, "There's someone outside my house. They're tapping on the windows." The operator's calm voice tried to soothe me, but I couldn't focus on her words. The tapping had stopped. The silence was worse. "Stay on the line," the operator said. "Officers are on their way." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and backed into the kitchen, gripping a knife from the counter. Loki had followed me, his low growl the only sound in the house. Then the porch light went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. I clutched the knife tighter, my breathing shallow. The operator was still talking, but her voice felt distant, drowned out by the pounding of my own heartbeat. A new sound filled the silence, a slow, deliberate creak. It was the sound of the front door opening. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. I was certain I had locked it. The creaking stopped, and I could hear soft, wet footsteps on the wooden floor of the entryway. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. I backed further into the kitchen, pressing myself against the counter. Loki hissed, his fur standing on end as he stared at the hallway. A shadow appeared in the doorway, tall and unmoving. "I called the police," I yelled, hoping to scare them off. The shadow tilted its head almost curiously. Then slowly it stepped forward, the dim light from the street revealing its face, or lack of one. Its skin was pale and smooth, completely featureless, like a mannequin brought to life. I froze, paralyzed by fear. The thing raised one hand, pointing directly at me. Then it spoke, its voice a hollow, echoing whisper. "You've been chosen." The next few minutes were a blur. The police arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the house and breaking the spell of terror. But by the time they got inside, the figure was gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to prove what I had seen. The officers reassured me that it was probably just a prank or a bad dream brought on by stress. But I knew better. The porch light hasn't flickered since that night. And every time I close my eyes, I see it, standing in the doorway, its featureless face staring back at me. Sometimes late at night, I think I can still hear it. The faint tapping. It all started with a wrong turn. As I held the photo in my trembling hands, the hum, that low, vibrating sound, began to fill my ears once more. It was As I held the photo in my trembling hands, the hum, that low, vibrating sound, began to fill my ears once more. It was faint at first, just a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second. I could feel it reverberating inside my skull, as though the very air around me had thickened, become heavier. The world outside my car seemed to blur, like a painting smeared with rain. The sky, once bright and clear, now felt oppressive, the sun muted as if something was blocking it. I slammed the photo down on the passenger seat, trying to push it away, but it remained there, taunting me. I reached for the door handle, but my fingers faltered. Something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my bones. The eerie stillness of the world around me seemed to press in, tightening with every breath I took. I had to leave. I threw the door open, my shoes scraping against the gravel as I stumbled out. The air was cold, colder than it should have been considering the season. My breath hung in the air in little puffs, like smoke from a dying fire. The world felt wrong. The road, once familiar, now seemed endless, as if it stretched into a void that led nowhere. The hum was louder now, closer. I could hear it vibrating in my chest, a deep, relentless thrum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I turned to look around, trying to get my bearings, but the landscape had changed. The trees, those old, gnarled things, were gone, replaced by a vast, featureless expanse of dirt and shadows. My car, parked neatly by the side of the road just moments before, was nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through me. I couldn't see anything but the barren, endless stretch of empty land. The road, where had it gone? There was nothing now but the sound of that hum, that low mechanical noise, drawing closer with every passing second. I began to walk. It was the only thing I could think to do. My feet moved automatically, one step after another, as if something else was controlling me. But as I walked, I began to feel it. The cold, a biting frost creeping up my legs, stealing the warmth from my skin. The landscape remained unchanged, the same barren dirt stretching endlessly before me. No sign of life, no sign of anything familiar, only the hum, louder now, shaking the air around me. And then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense, not something that could be heard with my ears, but something that I felt. It was as if the voice was inside my head, vibrating through my very thoughts. It whispered my name, just a soft breath, barely audible, but unmistakable. Welcome. My heart skipped a beat and I stopped in my tracks. The voice was familiar. It felt like something I had heard before, but I couldn't place it. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I turned in place, my eyes darting frantically in all directions. There was no one there. The hum was now a deafening roar, and I clamped my hands over my ears trying to block it out. But it was useless. Welcome, back. I froze. That voice, it wasn't just inside my head anymore, it was everywhere. A presence in the air, thick and suffocating, as though it were coming from every direction at once. I turned again, and this time I saw it. Standing in the distance, just beyond the horizon of barren land, was a figure. They were tall, draped in shadows, their outline indistinct, but I could feel their gaze on me. The hum surged, as if the figure itself were amplifying the noise. My eyes widened in fear as the figure began to move toward me. "Who are you?" I shouted, but my voice felt distant, hollow, swallowed by the overwhelming hum. The figure didn't respond. It moved in a way that worked. I'd been driving aimlessly through the countryside, trying to clear my head after a brutal week. Work had been relentless, and I needed the kind of peace only isolation could offer. My GPS had lost signal about an hour ago, but I wasn't worried. How lost could I get out here with nothing but fields and trees for miles? The sun was setting now, casting long golden shadows across the empty road. It felt endless, stretching far ahead and vanishing into the horizon. I turned the radio off, preferring the quiet hum of the engine and the rhythmic crunch of gravel under my tires. That's when I saw the sign. Welcome to Ravenswood. The letters were faded, the wood cracked and splintered. Beneath the name was a tagline, a place you'll never want to leave. It wasn't on the map, but the idea of a small town where I could stop for food or directions sounded perfect. The thought of seeing other people, even briefly, felt comforting after hours of solitude. The road narrowed as I approached, flanked by dense trees that seemed to grow closer with every mile. My car's headlights cut through the growing darkness, illuminating patches of gnarled branches. and then suddenly I was there. The town was eerily quiet. Rows of old brick buildings lined the main street, their windows dark and empty. A single street lamp flickered overhead, casting weak, uneven light onto the cracked pavement. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I slowed the car to a crawl, scanning for any signs of life. A diner caught my eye, its faded neon sign buzzing faintly. Eats. I parked and stepped out, the door of my car creaking loudly in the silence. As my feet hit the pavement, a chill ran through me. The air was colder here than it had been on the road. The diner's door swung open with a groan, and a bell above it jingled weakly. Inside, the smell of stale grease and something faintly metallic hit me immediately. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness. The place looked like it had been frozen in time. Plates of half-eaten food sat on the tables, their contents dried and crusted. A coffee cup rested on the counter, a faint ring of liquid still visible at the bottom. The jukebox in the corner was silent, its colorful lights long dead. As I moved further in, a photograph on the wall caught my attention. It was black and white, showing a group of people standing in front of the diner. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, just townsfolk posing for a picture. But their eyes, they were too sharp, too focused. It felt like they were staring directly at me. I shuddered and backed away, nearly tripping over a stool. Back outside, the street was just as deserted. I decided to walk around, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could tell me where I was. As I passed a general store, something in the window made me stop. It was a mannequin, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. At least I thought it was a mannequin. Its face was blank, featureless, but its posture seemed off, like it was mid-motion. As I walked past, I could have sworn its head shifted ever so slightly to follow me. "No," I whispered to myself, "it's just a trick of the light." But I quickened my pace anyway, my shoes crunching against the gravel. The town square was dominated by a clock tower, its face illuminated by a dim amber light. The hands were frozen at 11:59. I stood there for a moment, taking in the strange stillness. The faint metallic scent I'd noticed earlier was stronger now, almost overwhelming. Then I heard it. A hum. Faint at first, like distant machinery. It grew louder, vibrating in my chest. I turned, scanning the square for the source. And that's when I saw the figure. They were standing perfectly still at the edge of the square, their back to me. "Excuse me?" I called out, relief flooding through me at the sight of another person. They didn't move. I took a hesitant step closer. "Hey, I'm lost," and before I could finish, they turned. Their face was pale, their eyes wide and unblinking. But it wasn't just their expression that froze me in place. It was their mouth. There wasn't one, just smooth skin where their lips should have been. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at me. The hum grew deafening. I ran. I didn't think about where I was going, I just needed to get away. The streets blurred around me, dark buildings flashing past. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest tight with panic. When I finally stopped, I was back in front of the diner. "How?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I had been running straight, hadn't I? My car was gone. Heart pounding, I stumbled back inside the diner, slamming the door shut behind me. The photograph on the wall caught my eye again. This time it was different. The people weren't smiling anymore. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow. And in the middle of the group, it was me. The hum was back, louder than ever. The ground beneath me seemed to vibrate with it. I pressed my hands to my ears, backing away from the photo. When I turned, I wasn't in the diner anymore. I was in the middle of the town square. The clock tower's hands were moving now, ticking toward midnight. Figures surrounded me, dozens of them, all motionless and staring. Their eyeless faces were turned in my direction, their blank expressions radiating malice. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the hum. The clock struck midnight, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my car, parked on the side of an empty road. The sun was rising, and my GPS had signal again. For a moment, I thought it had all been a bad dream. But then I saw it. On the passenger seat was a photograph. It showed the town square, the eyeless figures, and me standing among them. My hands trembled as I stared at the photograph. It wasn't possible. How could someone have taken this? I hadn't stood in the square like that. Or at least I didn't remember doing so. My chest tightened, my breathing uneven. I threw the photograph onto the seat beside me and gripped the steering wheel, trying to focus. I just needed to drive. Putting the car into gear, I sped off down the road. The sunlight filtering through the trees should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Every shadow seemed to ripple, like something was moving just beyond my vision. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The town wasn't there anymore. The road I had come from was now an unbroken stretch of asphalt surrounded by forest. It was as if Ravenswood had been swallowed whole, leaving nothing behind, not even the sign. Hours passed, or at least I thought they did. My phone's clock was frozen at 12:01 no matter how far I drove. My GPS signal flickered on and off, sometimes showing me in the middle of nowhere, other times placing me in towns I knew I hadn't passed. My stomach churned with unease. The photograph still sat on the passenger seat, mocking me. I tried throwing it out the window once, but when I glanced back at the seat, it was there again. The sun never moved from its position, hanging low in the sky like it was stuck in perpetual mourning. Then I saw the gas station. It was a small, run-down building, the kind you only see in horror movies. A single pump stood out front, its hose dangling limply. The neon sign in the window buzzed faintly, spelling out "open" in flickering red letters. Against my better judgment, I pulled in. The door creaked as I stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, rows of dusty shelves stocked with faded cans and snacks that looked older than me. At the counter sat a man wearing a dirty trucker hat, his face partially obscured by shadows. "Morning," he drawled, without looking up from the newspaper spread out in front of him. Morning," I replied, hesitantly approaching the counter. "Need gas?" he asked, finally glancing up. His eyes were sharp, too sharp, like they were piercing through me. "Yeah, and directions if you don't mind. I think I'm lost." The man chuckled, a low, rasping sound that sent a chill down my spine. Everyone who ends up here is lost, one way or another. I frowned. What's that supposed to mean? He didn't answer, instead pointing toward the photograph I'd unconsciously brought in with me. "Been to Ravenswood, huh?" My blood ran cold. "You know about it?" He nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. "You're not the first to come through here with one of those." "One of what?" I demanded, my voice rising. Instead of answering, he reached under the counter and pulled out a shoebox. Inside were dozens of photographs, each one identical to mine, showing different people standing in the town square surrounded by eyeless figures. What is this?" I whispered, my hands shaking as I flipped through the photos. "Ravenswood doesn't like to be found," he said, his tone grave. "But sometimes it pulls people in. And when it does, it leaves a mark." I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a display of potato chips. "No, this doesn't make any sense. I just got lost. It was a mistake." The man shook his head. "It's never a mistake." Before I could respond, the lights in the gas station flickered. The humming sound was back, low and ominous, vibrating through the floor. The man's expression darkened. "You need to go, now." "But..." "Now." Something in his tone made me listen. Grabbing the photograph, I bolted out the door and jumped into my car. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me as I sped away, the gas station disappearing in my rearview mirror. But no matter how far I drove, the hum wouldn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, filling the car until I thought my head might split. Then the road ended. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a halt. Ahead of me was the town square. It was exactly as I remembered, dark, oppressive, the clock tower's hands still frozen at 11:59. The figures were there too, standing motionless in a perfect circle around the square. And in the middle, waiting for me, was the man from the gas station. He smiled, a slow, chilling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You can't leave," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Not until it's done." Not until what's done, I shouted, stepping out of the car. The figures began to move, their blank faces turning toward me in unison. Ravenswood chooses, the man said, his voice shifting, becoming layered and distorted. And it's chosen you. I backed away, but the figures closed in, their movements slow and deliberate. The hum was deafening now, pulsing through my skull. The man stepped forward, holding out a photograph. It showed me standing in the center of the square, surrounded by the figures. But this time my face was blank, eyeless, just like theirs. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real." "Ravenswood is always real," the man said, his voice dripping with finality. The last thing I saw was the clock striking midnight. When I woke up, I was back in my car again. The road was empty, the sun rising. But this time, the photograph wasn't on the seat. It was in my hand, and my face in the picture was gone. I was driving home late that night, the kind of late where the highways stretch on forever and the world feels eerily quiet. The night sky hung heavy, thick with a looming sense of something unseen. It was cold, and my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I turned onto the narrow country road leading to my town, Ravenswood. The air carried an uneasy stillness, as if the world had paused. The faint beam of my headlights illuminated the winding path ahead, the road's edges swallowed by dense woods that lined either side. Even in the familiar confines of this road, something felt different tonight. The trees appeared taller, their bare branches stretched toward the heavens like skeletal hands, clawing at the darkness. I shook off the feeling, convincing myself it was just the fatigue settling in after a long day. Just as I crested the hill overlooking the darkened town, my headlights flickered briefly. A moment later they stabilized, illuminating the path ahead. But below, the town of Ravenswood, my home, looked wrong. From this vantage point, the familiar streets appeared cloaked in a dim, sickly glow. The streetlights, which usually bathed the square in a warm amber light, now emitted a faint greenish hue, and the old clock tower that stood at the heart of the square, a beacon of timelessness, seemed to loom larger than usual, its spire disappearing into the fog that had inexplicably rolled in. I slowed the car, leaning forward to get a better look, but the strange scene offered no clarity, only more questions. As I approached the outskirts of the town, my car sputtered unexpectedly. The engine coughed, jerking slightly before cutting out entirely. I cursed under my breath and guided the car to the shoulder. The eerie quiet enveloped me as I stepped out, the cold biting against my skin. The dashboard clock read 11:45 p.m. Pulling my phone from my pocket, I glanced at the screen. No signal, typical for this stretch of road. But tonight it felt like more than a technological inconvenience. A shiver ran through me, and not just from the chill in the air. I was close to town. Walking would only take a few minutes. With a resigned sigh, I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and began the trek toward Ravenswood's dimly lit square. The crunch of gravel beneath my boots was the only sound accompanying me. The world around me felt unnaturally still, as if the very earth was holding its breath. The wind barely stirred, yet the tall grass lining the road swayed gently, almost as if unseen hands were brushing through it. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the safety of the town, but was it safety I was walking toward? The closer I got to the square, the heavier the air seemed to grow. By the time I reached the edge of the main street, I was struggling to breathe evenly. The town, usually quaint and welcoming even at night, now felt alien. The buildings seemed taller, leaning ever so slightly inward, as if conspiring to block out the sky. Shadows moved unnaturally, stretching in directions that defied the logic of the dim streetlights. And then I saw them. A crowd of figures filled the square, standing completely still. At first I thought they were mannequins, perhaps part of some bizarre art installation I hadn't heard about. But as I stepped closer, my stomach churned with unease. These weren't mannequins. They were humanoid, but wrong. Their heads were tilted at unnatural angles, and their limbs were stiff and angular. Most horrifying of all was their faces, or the lack thereof, where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my grip as I swept its beam over the figures. There were dozens of them, maybe more, standing in perfect rows. They faced the clock tower, their posture unnervingly rigid. The beam of my flashlight caught a faint shimmer on their skin, almost like they were coated in a thin layer of frost or glass. My heart pounded against my ribs, a primal instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. Summoning every ounce of courage, I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the heavy silence of the square. The figures didn't move. I took a cautious step forward and then another. The crunch of my boots felt deafening. As if triggered by my approach, the figures began to shift, slowly at first, their heads twisting toward me in jerky mechanical motions. One by one, the eyeless faces turned in my direction until I was the sole focus of their attention. A low, guttural hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It wasn't coming from any one figure. It emanated from all of them, a collective noise that grew louder with each passing second. Panic took over and I stumbled back, tripping over the uneven cobblestones. As I hit the ground, my flashlight rolled out of my hand, casting erratic beams of light across the square. The figures began to move, their stiff limbs jerking as they shuffled toward me. Their movements were unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings, yet horrifyingly efficient. The hum grew louder, transforming into a discordant symphony that seemed to pierce my very soul. Scrambling to my feet, I turned and ran. My breath came in ragged gasps as I darted through the narrow alleys of Ravenswood, the shadows twisting and dancing around me. The figures were behind me. I could feel their presence more than I could hear their pursuit. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, only to see their featureless faces illuminated by the faint greenish glow that seemed to follow them. I ducked into an alleyway, pressing myself against the cold brick wall, my chest heaving. The humming had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. For a moment I dared to believe I'd lost them. But as I peered around the corner, my blood ran cold. One of the figures stood at the end of the alley, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It raised a hand, pointing directly at me. The hum returned, louder and more insistent. From behind the figure, more began to emerge, their movements synchronized like a grotesque dance. My survival instincts kicked in, and I bolted in the opposite direction, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder than I thought possible. Clock tower. The only place that seemed safe was the clock tower. Its imposing structure had always been a landmark of Ravenswood, a symbol of permanence and stability. Now it loomed like a dark sentinel, its glowing clock face a beacon in the unnatural night. I didn't know why I thought it would protect me, but I had no other options. Bursting through the heavy wooden doors, I slammed them shut behind me, throwing the iron bolt into place. The interior of the tower was dimly lit by the faint glow of the clock face above. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by my frantic entrance. The hum outside grew louder, and I could hear the faint sound of hands, or whatever the figures had, scraping against the door. I climbed the spiral staircase, each step echoing in the hollow chamber. The higher I went, the more the air seemed to thin, making it harder to breathe. My legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop until I reached the top. The room housing the clock's mechanism was cramped, filled with gears and levers that ticked with a mechanical precision. Peering out the small window, I saw the square below. The figures had gathered, standing in perfect rows once more. They seemed to be waiting, their eyeless faces turned upward, staring directly at me. My hand trembled as I backed away from the window, my back pressing against the cold metal of the clock's inner workings. A low creak echoed through the chamber. I spun around, my heart plummeting. One of the figures was inside the tower, its angular silhouette framed by the stairwell. How it had gotten past the bolted door, I didn't know. It stepped forward, its movements slow but deliberate. Behind it, more figures began to emerge, filling the narrow staircase. I was trapped. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. The figures didn't answer. They simply advanced, the hum growing deafening. I pressed myself against the clock mechanism, my mind racing for a way out. And then I saw it, a faint glow emanating from the center of the clock's gears. It pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. Drawn to it, I reached out, my fingers brushing against the glowing core. A jolt of energy surged through me, and suddenly, the world shifted. The figures froze, their heads snapping toward the clock's mechanism in unison. The hum stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against my eardrums. Visions flooded my mind, images of Ravenswood as it once was, a thriving town full of life. And then, the flood. The water had come without warning, swallowing the town and its inhabitants whole. The clock tower had been the only structure to survive, its glowing mechanism preserving the souls of the townsfolk in a desperate attempt to save them. The figures weren't just creatures, they were the remnants of those who had perished, their humanity stripped away by decades of imprisonment within the clock's cursed mechanisms, and now they wanted release. The glowing core pulsed in my hands, its warmth spreading through my body. I understood what I had to do. To destroy the core would free the souls. The chill in the air made me shiver as I walked into the lobby of my apartment building, my footsteps echoing softly in the quiet space. I glanced up at the dimly lit elevator doors. It was late, past midnight, but I wasn't in a rush. It had been a long day at work, and I just wanted to crawl into bed. The elevator felt like a safe haven compared to the deserted, eerie silence of the building's hallways. I pressed the button for the elevator, waiting as the familiar soft ding signaled its arrival. The door slid open slowly, revealing a man standing at the far end of the elevator. His face was partially obscured by a hoodie, but I could see enough to know he was about my height. His eyes, they were dark, almost too dark, and when they met mine for just a moment in the reflection of the elevator doors, a shiver ran down my spine. I stepped inside, trying to avoid staring at him, but the tension in the small space was palpable. The air felt heavier, suffocating, as if something was pressing down on me. I tried to look away, focusing on the numbers above the door, waiting for the elevator to start moving. He didn't speak, not a word. It felt wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. I pressed the button for my floor, and the elevator lurched into motion. The lights flickered slightly, and for a split second, I thought it was just my imagination, but no. The elevator did feel strange, as though the building was alive, watching us. As we moved upward, I counted the floors in my head, the third, the fourth, the fifth. It was then that I realized something. I wasn't sure whether I had been staring at the floor numbers or at him. His eyes, those deep, dark eyes, never left me. I tried to shake it off, but the weight of his gaze lingered like a shadow. The elevator stopped on the fourth floor, and with a quiet ding, the doors opened. Without a word, the man stepped out of the elevator. He didn't even glance back, he just walked, his footsteps heavy, deliberate, and distant. "Good night," he said softly over his shoulder, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unsure of what to say. He was gone before I could form any words, and the elevator doors closed behind him, leaving me alone. As the elevator continued its ascent, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The man's presence, his cold silence, it lingered. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had narrowly escaped something, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. The elevator arrived at my floor and I quickly stepped out, walking to my apartment with hurried steps. My keys felt cold in my hand as I fumbled with them, eager to get inside. When I finally unlocked the door and stepped into the safety of my apartment, I locked it behind me and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I stood there for a moment, leaning against the door, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that clung to me. The encounter had been harmless, I told myself. He was just a man, probably a new tenant or a visitor, nothing to worry about. But still, something about him didn't sit right. The silence of my apartment was both comforting and suffocating at once. I tried to distract myself by going through my evening routine, changing into pajamas, reheating leftovers, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, but every creak of the building, every small sound made me jump. It was nothing, I told myself, just paranoia. But deep down I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, after a restless night, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. My mind raced with questions. Who was he? Why had he been in the building? And why hadn't he said anything more than those 2 words, good night? I needed to know more, so I decided to ask Mrs. Calder. She lived directly across the hall from me and knew everything about the building and its tenants. She could tell me if someone new had moved in, or if I had simply misjudged the situation. When I knocked on her door, she opened it almost immediately, her bright smile welcoming me. "Good morning, dear," she said cheerfully. "What can I do for you?" "Morning," I replied, my voice tight with unease. "I just wanted to ask, did someone new move in on the 4th floor?" Mrs. Calder's smile faded slightly and she furrowed her brow. "No, dear, no one's moved in recently. The last people to move in were the young couple on the 2nd floor, and that was months ago." I felt my stomach drop. "You're sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Positive," she replied. "I keep track of everything around here. Why do you ask?" I saw a man in the elevator last night," I said, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. "He said he had just moved in." She gave me a curious look, her brows furrowing further. "Well, that's strange. I haven't heard anything about anyone new on the 4th floor. Not in weeks." "Wow." I forced a smile, trying to hide the growing panic inside me. "I see. Thanks, Mrs. Calder. I just wanted to be sure." As I walked back to my apartment, my heart was pounding in my chest. My mind raced with confusion and fear. If the man hadn't been a tenant, then who was he? What was he doing in the building? Was I just imagining things? That night, I felt the fear creeping back. I double-checked the locks on my windows and doors, even though I knew it wouldn't help. The footsteps, the knocking, they still echoed in my mind. I left the lights on in the living room, as if somehow that would make everything feel safer. Around midnight I heard it. The same faint rhythmic creaking. Footsteps. They were soft at first, like a faint whisper against the silence of the night. I told myself it was nothing, just someone else in the building. Maybe a neighbor returning home, but the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat as the sound stopped. Right outside my door. I froze. Thud. A single knock, soft but deliberate. I didn't move. The seconds stretched on forever, my heart thundering in my chest. I held my breath, praying the noise would stop, but it didn't. The silence that followed was almost worse than the knock itself. It was thick, suffocating, as if the world had come to a halt. Then the footsteps began again, but this time they didn't retreat. The soft scrape of something being dragged against the wall sent a chill down my spine. It was slow, methodical, like someone, or something, was moving closer. My eyes darted to the door, but I couldn't bring myself to move, to even look through the peephole. I felt my pulse in my throat, my hands trembling as I clutched my phone, too scared to call anyone. I was paralyzed by fear, trapped in the silence of the apartment. Then finally the noise stopped. The dragging ceased, the footsteps disappeared. I sat there motionless, unable to make a sound, waiting. The minutes passed in agonizing slowness, but the quiet was maddening. When I finally mustered the courage to look outside, the hallway was empty. Empty. But I knew what I had heard, and it wasn't just my imagination. The next morning I found an envelope taped to my door. I opened it carefully, my hands shaking. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message scrawled in messy, almost frantic handwriting. "Why did you tell?" The words sent a cold shiver down my spine. My eyes darted down the hallway. No one was there. No footsteps, no sounds. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this apartment, in this building. I packed a bag, grabbed my phone, and left. I didn't go to work that day. I didn't care. I went straight to a hotel and called the police. They came. They searched the building, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No one matching the man's description. The building was quiet. Too quiet. But I knew the truth. He was still here, somewhere, waiting.